In the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night, in the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night. Hello everyone, I'm Anthropomantic Fiend and I do horror-related things on the internet. And today I'm reviewing Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter. This is a review that was requested of me quite a while back by Marty from the Trash Picture Show. It also has a very tenuous maybe connection to the Karnstein trilogy, and even though I personally don't think that this movie is connected to the Karnstein trilogy at all, I used reviewing this on his request as an excuse to just review the whole Karnstein trilogy because I wanted to. Marty is a great guy, really supportive of so many people in the horror community and just in the YouTube and even Twitch communities in general, and he has a great channel of his own talking about a lot of great geeky topics, so if you're not subscribed to him, I will link him either up here or in the cards, or both. Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter is a movie that came out in 1974. It was directed by Brian Clemens, whose only other directorial credit that I could find is one episode of the show Shooting Gallery, but he wrote quite a few movies and TV shows, including Hammer's Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, See No Evil, and multiple episodes of the 60s Avengers TV show, which has nothing to do with Marvel. And this film stars the legendary Carolyn Monroe, who has been in a lot of Hammer films, including Dracula AD 1972, as well as Slaughter High and Maniac. Horst Jensen, or Jensen, I'm not sure how that is pronounced. He was in No Gold for a Dead Diver, Long Live Your Death, and Escape from East Berlin. Wanda Vintham, who is in Invasion UFO, The Blood Beast Terror, and Asylum, and Shane Bryant, who was in the 1973 version of The Picture of Dorian Gray, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, and Demons of the Mind. Of course, once again, this is another Hammer Films production, and it is very tenuously possibly connected to the Karnstein trilogy, because one character says that she is a Karstein, which is not the same thing as a Karnstein in my opinion at all, but I do like speculating about how this movie might be connected to the Karnstein trilogy anyway. This film follows a man named Captain Kronos, or Kronos, it's pronounced slightly different by different characters, and his companion, Professor Grost. They arrive in a little village that is being plagued by vampire attacks. They free a young girl who has been put in the stocks, apparently just because she danced on a Sunday, which is stupid, and she becomes part of their group. Kronos reunites with an old friend of his from a war that he apparently fought in, who is now a doctor. These people who are turning up, who we already know are the victims of vampire attacks, are inexplicably aged. They're typically very young girls, but they've become way older than they should be over the span of minutes. Kronos and Grost quickly deduce that this is the work of vampires, and so set out to hunt down the creatures of the night that are plaguing this village. So the score for this film was done by Laurie Johnson, who also scored A Ghost in Monte Carlo, It's Alive 3, Island of the Alive, which I had no idea was a thing until very recently, and also scored many episodes of The Avengers. And his score for this film is, again, in very much the same vein as a lot of scores for a lot of Hammer's horror movies. It's very bombastic and over the top, but it's not quite as dissonant as some scores are, just to emphasize the horror of everything, because this movie has a slightly different tone from a lot of those movies. So the score is generally a lot more melodic, even when it's being dark, and I really appreciated that. Captain Kronos has this fun little theme that accompanies him. It's kind of this triumphant, trumpety theme. It feels very heroic, but it is still in a minor key, which I thought was kind of cool because it emphasizes kind of the swashbuckling hero aspect of the story while still firmly planting it in horror. Visually speaking, I don't think this film is quite as striking as some Hammer movies in some ways, just in terms of the production design itself, but it still is pretty cool. I liked how it effectively blends the feel of their past gothic horror films with kind of a swashbuckling sword hero thing, much like I said about the score, especially since there's already a lot of overlap in terms of costuming and settings with those two genres anyway, in my opinion. Much like we have seen in Lust for a Vampire and Twins of Evil, we also get another vampire walking around shadowed in a hooded cloak, so I liked that that is a continuing thing in this Karnstein movie. It is probably the least visually appealing of all the cloaks. It's a very bland, not particularly interestingly textured black cloak, but it gets the job done. Cinematography-wise, this movie is super overwrought. There's this shot where someone is being stalked by a vampire inside a church, and you think that there's a silhouette of the cross up on the wall, but then the person's arms lower, and you realize it's actually a person who's been standing like this for some reason, and it's an interesting visual, but it's also just weird. Later on, when people arrive at the same church, there is blood on the church bell, and you have no idea how it's gotten there. It's just a very over-the-top visual. It's pretty cool, but it's also just a little bit silly, especially because of this movie's clearly very low budget. And there's also just some extreme close-ups and zoom-ins on things where it's just like, all right, they were already getting across this thing with their eyes and their face just as actors. You don't need to zoom this far in on their face for me to understand, okay? It's pretty heavy-handed and overwrought with some of the visuals. That makes it kind of laughable, but also really fun. I really enjoyed just how needlessly intense some of the shots in this movie are. I forget the name of the aristocratic family who we meet. They are presumed to be vampires by the audience throughout the film. It's not made clear until the end of the film whether they are or they're not, but I really like the look of their residence. Unlike other presumed vampiric lairs in a lot of other Hammer movies, even something like Horror of Dracula or Scars of Dracula, where the vampire is still pretending to be human, their home is just so clearly gothic and a little bit run down that you know from the get-go that they're a vampire. The residence of this aristocratic family is very lush and vibrant. There's a lot of color to everything, and it's very, very elegant, and it is probably the most beautiful set in the film. If we're trying to connect this to the Karnstein trilogy, it feels like what Castle Karnstein might have been, or what one of the residences of one of the Karnstein family members might have been pre the events of other films before everything decays. Story-wise, again, the Karnstein connection here is tenuous at best. That is especially because these vampires operate on a wholly different set of rules than the vampires in the Karnstein trilogy, or the vampires in their Dracula movies, or the vampires in some of their other vampire movies like Vampire Circus. Again, these people, when they are found as victims, aren't even really turning into vampires. Sometimes people who are bitten do, but most of these people are just aging dramatically and then dying. And they are explained by Professor Gross as not being drained of blood, but being drained of their youth and of their life essence, almost like the space vampires in the 80s movie Life Force, which is a weird thing to have in your gothic swashbuckling adventure period piece, but okay. And there are just so many weird things about the lore of these vampires. The rules are very much up in the air. Frost is kind of like, you know, some vampires drink blood, some don't. Some can be killed by the stake and decapitation. Some are killed by the cross. Sometimes it has to be a steel cross, and sometimes you have to stab them with that cross. And some vampires are killed by running water, and some aren't. And there are other just really weird little pieces of lore that they throw in. They have this little way of hunting down vampires, which is burying dead toads in a box, so that if a vampire passes by, presumably some of the life energy that they have sucked out of somebody else will pass into the toad and bring it back to life, which happens a couple times in the movie. I don't know how they came up with it. In the movie, they claim that's like an old folk rhyme. So maybe that's a part of some lore, but I've never heard that anywhere else. It's just very strange. But all of those weird touches do add to the charm of the film for me. I can't say that it's necessarily a positive. I personally enjoy it, and it definitely doesn't hurt the film. Mostly it's just really weird. And if we are placing this within the Karnstein trilogy, it would have to take place well before the other films. I don't know if I would call this film medieval, but it is probably pre the witch hunt era that Twins of Evil is set in. So the chronology of all of these films would probably be Captain Kronos, then Twins of Evil, then The Vampire Lovers, then Lust for a Vampire. That said, the way the Karnsteins or Karsteins are talked about in this film, I don't really see how they would line up with any of the other movies. So again, very tenuous connection, still kind of fun to speculate about, and fun to compare to the Karnstein trilogy. The way that the vampires operate in this movie are very interesting. Again, just going under the assumption that these aristocrats are vampires, because we don't know whether they are or not until the end of the film, and I'm not going to spoil that for you. The idea that this vampire or vampires within the aristocracy are not out as vampires to the rest of the village and are kind of just accepted as the norm is a very different take than what we see in the Karnstein trilogy or any of their Dracula movies, which I thought was cool. And it feels like the villagers don't even accept the existence of vampires. They don't really talk about it. It's more the outsider, Kronos, who brings that idea into the village. Nobody else in the village is talking about it, and usually it's the opposite. All the villagers know the lore of vampires, and the outsider has to be educated on that. It's a slight reversal of the norm for a lot of Hammer movies and a lot of gothic horror in general, which I thought was cool. There are a few scenes of a vampire preying on victims who are the same gender as that vampire, but the homoerotic overtones of the first two movies in the Karnstein trilogy, much like with Twins of Evil, are pretty much absent here, and this film is decidedly less erotic in general than any films in the Karnstein trilogy, and they aren't really preying on members of the aristocracy. It is a aristocratic vampire or vampires preying on the lower class. I don't really think there's meant to be any kind of message or subtext there intentionally, but it is definitely continuing a tradition that has been there for a while within vampire stories. But at the same time, Kronos himself apparently has aristocratic blood. He says so himself, but he also seems to be something of a renegade, so there's a slightly different dynamic than with those stories introduced here, which is neither good nor bad. It's just kind of interesting. Kronos himself has this untold history to his character that makes his character particularly intriguing. He seems to have this war history with the village doctor. He talks about being of aristocratic stock, although we don't know what that really means. He has this big K on a ring and emblazoned on everything. He's very proud of who he is. There's just all this backstory that seems to be there that's never delved into, which I kind of wish we got a little bit more of, but not knowing is kind of what kept me intrigued by his character at the same time. There is a kind of insta-romance between Kronos and Caroline Munro's character that was a little bit perplexing to me. There didn't really seem to be any kind of precursor to that, but it makes some sense, I guess, because Kronos does free her from the stocks. I would be happy to be around someone who had freed me and not be in the stocks anymore too, so I guess there is some precursor to it. It's definitely a better sort of insta-romance than what we get in Lust for a Vampire, which I still absolutely despise. And then there are just some story points in this movie that I find very weird and very funny besides the vampire lore. Namely, there are just these deeply uncomfortable scenes between this gang of sword-wielding ruffians in this one bar and some other people. There's a scene where they horribly underpay and mock and mistreat this prostitute who this character had just had some time with, and he, like, doesn't give her the pay that she was promised, and then throws the rest of the pay into a freaking spittoon, which she naturally does not want to dig through. Him and all of his friends are laughing about it, and there's just this one guy in the back of the room who's just scowling at them because of course, and he just walks up to this guy and is like, "You're not laughing. You should be laughing," and points his sword at him and forces him to laugh, and his fake laughter is just so deeply uncomfortable. And then later on there's a confrontation between him and Kronos that I don't want to spoil for you, but it is very over the top, very funny to me, and the way everything plays out almost feels like a scene out of a Western. And we also get a scene where a character becomes a vampire, inexplicably for some reason, because he's the only character to be bitten who doesn't just die. They decide that to figure out how to kill these particular vampires, because rules are up in the air, and because the guy is literally screaming and begging for death, they're just going to kill him. They literally, like, try staking him and try hanging him and do multiple things that don't work, and for some reason that's really funny to me. It's actually kind of dark, but I think my brain was conflating it a little bit with the really weird episode of The Addams Family where Gomez keeps trying to kill himself with Fester's help, and they just keep failing. It really had the same energy as that to me for some reason, so I just found it funny, even though maybe I shouldn't. But in that scene as well, Kronos reveals that he has survived a vampire bite, and apparently he's survived a ridiculous amount of things, so he's just this amazingly superpowered character. And again, I just want to know this guy's backstory and why he's just so ridiculously basically invincible. And because this has more of a fantasy adventure feel combined with gothic horror, I wish there were a few more fights and action scenes than we got. The ones that we do get aren't the most amazing choreography in the world, but I do find them really fun at the same time. Ultimately, I wish there were more, but I was satisfied. Character-wise, I've already talked about Kronos quite a bit. He's very enigmatic. I was uncertain if I actually liked him as a character or not at first, but he does enough noble and kind things while still having this dark side to him that ultimately I did like him. Grost is quite likable, as is Caroline Munro's character. I wish both of them were fleshed out quite a bit more, especially Caroline Munro, because she's really just this girl who is rescued by Kronos, and the only thing we know about her is that she was put in the stocks for dancing on a Sunday. She does end up being integral to the plot by the end of the story, but she doesn't really have a lot of character traits at all. At least with Grost, he does seem to have a distinct personality and a history with Kronos. We don't get any of that with Caroline Munro's character. As for the possibly vampires, possibly not aristocrats, I thought they were pretty cool. One of them is named Paul, and he has a sister, and they have an extremely old mother that they're taking care of. Paul and the old woman aren't particularly interesting. I thought the sister was a really interesting character. She is very reminiscent in some ways to me at least, of both Countess Elizabeth Bathory and the character of Gabrielle in The Vampire Lestat. She's very Bathory-like in the sense that she is obsessed with youth and can't bring herself to look at her aging mother because she never wants to become that old. She's very Gabrielle-like to me, primarily because of the way she dresses. She has a somewhat androgynous style. Her hair is very cut short, and she wears these very elegant suits similar to what her brother wears, which reminded me of the way when Gabrielle in The Vampire Lestat becomes a vampire, she tries to cut her hair short, even though that doesn't work, and begins dressing in men's clothing. She might be a vampire, but she also might just be very vain and have a slightly different fashion sense than the other female characters in the film. Effects-wise, we have more fake blood like what we get in basically every Hammer film ever. It's not realistic, but I still like it. There are some aging effects done on different characters when they have the life drained from them. Some are clearly makeup effects, and some are clearly older actors put in the same costume as the younger actor. Both work, and both really weird me out every single time for some reason. And there are some shots of old school hand-drawn lightning, which never looks real, but I always like it anyway. And there is one scene where a character is just walking along and gets a bat right in their face. The random bat scene is way cheesier than anything in even Scars of Dracula, which just has some of the most bizarre, insane, hilarious bat scenes in any of Hammer's vampire movies, but this bat is particularly funny because it never even moves. It's clearly just a prop that has been put in this person's face, and this is especially funny because we never see a bat transformation in any other part of the movie. In the rest of the film, every other vampire attack has just been a human or humanoid form vampire character, and in this scene, this person just has a random bat clinging to their face, and it never happens again, and it's just hysterical. All in all, this is not one of Hammer's best vampire movies, but I do find it a lot of fun. It has its own weird lore that it goes on, even though it doesn't seem to be totally clear on what its own lore is. It has, again, more of that kind of swashbuckling fantasy adventure feel to everything that was fun. If you enjoy Hammer's other vampire movies, if you enjoy shows like Castlevania, which I'm sure took some partial inspiration from this, and if you just want a fun, not particularly deep, low-budget horror film to watch, I think you will really enjoy this one. This movie is currently free to watch on YouTube. Hammer themselves have put it up. There are quite a few ads that you're going to have to get through, but you can watch it there just fine. I'm pretty sure Scream Factory have also released this one. I would like to buy that at some point, and it is available to buy or rent on a lot of different streaming services. That is my review of Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!